Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I would like to welcome everyone to this very important conversation on sacred manhood between emasculation and hashtag red pill. We have the author of Fatwa with us tonight, uh, raising male into sacred manhood, Imam Dawud Walid. Before we get started, I just wanted to give some background information about NIMS, the Nagamiya Institute of Islamic Medical Sciences. It's a very exciting time with NIMS. We have recently opened the first Quran museum in North America, which is located in Rolling Meadows, Illinois. We have an amazing collection, quite old Qurans and other artifacts from the Islamic civilization. And so we're looking to expand our museum and also offer programming that enriches the lives of Muslims throughout the United States and also give some civilizational confidence about Islam's rich history and contribution to the world. So please like our Facebook page and follow us on YouTube. Setting the stage for tonight's conversation, there have been a lot of changes in the realm of sex, gender. There has been a lot of rising forces challenging manhood, womanhood. Even from a general societal perspective, there's been massive social change. Gender norms have been challenged. The confusion of the role and women is pervasive. It has created confusion and chaos in the minds of everyone. Some men and women are intimidated by the current challenges. Some men have taken the easy and undesirable way out, using addictions and other coping mechanisms to deal with it. This has created men to be discontent and have lost their sense of identity, responsibility, and contribution to the world at large and their families. The feeling of apathy and lack of self-esteem has created a big loss in human development and progress. They're living a life that is not as anchoring or supportive to society. This is one of the biggest challenges of the world right now. This is a huge challenge to our youth and young adults. This is why we are addressing this issue. This is a timely issue. Someone asked me, how does this fit into the medical sciences? Well, psychologically, spiritually, socially, these are huge issues that society is dealing with, and Islamic thought and literature gives us a baseline and intellectual structure on how to behave and fulfill our lives as Muslims. When I look around my community, I see lots of people repping Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X paraphernalia on their Facebook. They got big old Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali. But if you ask them, do you realize that Muhammad Ali had extreme courage, bravery, and strength? It's like, yeah, man, but he also has a dope shirt. It also makes me look dope or makes me look cool. They're not necessarily inculcating those strong attributes that we connect with some of these people. We have people wearing Malcolm X t-shirts, which is, now just kind of part of the culture, but they don't understand that he spoke truth to power, had courage, bravery, and compassion towards others. And so we are trying to bring a bigger and deeper understanding to some of these issues, rather than just having these symbols but don't have a deep understanding. The same is true for people who talk about Tipu Sultan, Aurangzeb, Imam Shamil, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. These names are oft quoted but not deeply understood, and more have become fashion swag versus actual real substance. I am familiar with Chicago Sharif, the western suburbs. The organizing theme for most Muslim males is new restaurants or where they can get a Zabiha burger. If a Zabiha burger place opens up, it's lights out, like 200 miles an hour trying to get there. I affectionately call this place Darul Burger. So what happened to living a purposeful life or having traits that would make you want to help your community? One other point on this topic is that this is very relevant. If you haven't heard of hashtag red pill or some of the things we're going to talk about, this is what's really going on with a lot of the youth today. And it's not just the youth. I mean, this is extending all into the 40s, 50s. People are talking about these issues. Finally, because some of these issues have not been addressed by masajid and scholars clearly, people are turning to online forums where there's no connection with any person in the community physically. There's people like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, which some people have become their sheikhs for many shunned youth, this is their opportunity to air their grievances or hear someone that talks to them. So some of these characters who are on in this online space affecting our youth are putting out definitions of male and masculinity that can be harmful. So I'm very grateful on having Imam Dawud here because I've been thinking about this. I saw his book, and me and my co-host tonight, we looked through and we're like, SubhanAllah, this is something we definitely needed in our community. We're hoping to start the conversation. So let me introduce my co-host, Dr. Amir Hassan, who's a practicing hospitalist in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He's also a student of knowledge in different institutions, such as Maqasid. He's also known as A1 because he tenderizes people on the basketball court like steak sauce, and is a street ball legend. So we'll go to A1.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you, Brother Shahab. Bismillah wa alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum to you, Brother Shahab, and assalamu alaikum to our beloved guest, Imam Dawood. As mentioned, my name is Amir Hassan, and it is a pleasure and a blessing to speak to you, Imam, tonight. Firstly, I want to express to you on behalf of countless brothers and myself our appreciation and gratitude to you for this timely and relevant book. For those who may not have read it as yet, mashallah, this is a book written and presented with ihsan. Not only is the content so beneficial, but the presentation is unique and beautiful, from the quality of the paper to the pictures chosen to highlight each character trait that contributes to what fatwa means as a whole. And with regard to the content, the book is short, concise, and impactful, a compilation and elucidation of beautiful qualities that the ideal Muslim man should possess or strive to possess, i.e., the fatta, the young man, in pursuit of realizing fatwa. And you've done a wonderful job in this fluid writing style with very inspiring stories consisting of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, Muslim saints of the past, and of course, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as we enter this month of his blessed birth, Rabi al-Awwal. So we commend you and everyone who worked on this project. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and accept your efforts, and the same for all others who contributed to this book. So, in proceeding with our discussion on this topic of fatwa, that Brother Shahab and I, we had this discussion just this previous week. Fatwa, otherwise known by some as sacred manhood in Islam or Islamic chivalry. To proceed with this discussion, just to piggyback on what Shahab said, perhaps we can discuss a little further on why it's necessary now more than ever before. In reading and listening to contemporary shayukh and academic scholars, it seems that modern man is facing an identity crisis. More and more of his traditional roles that signify transition into manhood, are being lost. And this is leaving a vacuum in his life. For example, pre modern roles of going way back, hunter, gatherer, warrior, protector, and up until recently, being the sole breadwinner. All of these roles are now either unnecessary in a postmodern world, or they're being fulfilled by women just the same. So modern man therefore seems to be at a crossroads, not sure how to proceed forward. And as a result of this, some would argue that he remains in a arrested phase, a youth phase, or what we could call, and is mentioned in the book, a man child. What's interesting is that in the book's foreword, Mulana Asam Ayub, he mentions one of two primary causes for the modern man child. The first cause is a loss of rituals, and it occurred to us that it was the traditional male roles that we just alluded to, roles that are now lost, that consisted of rites of passage, of routine and ritual. Now, the second of the two primary causes for the man child, as mentioned in the foreword, is the absence of true father figures. The statement seems to suggest that a father simply being present is not enough. One requires a truly involved and enlightened father for one to grow into proper manhood. Additionally, in your preface and introduction, you mentioned that we do not need more males, we need more men. Contemporary male youth are an unmotivated generation of young individuals resistant to take on life's next stages of responsibilities. So, attempting to bring everything together, it seems we live in a society in perpetual pursuit of happiness and pleasure, as that being the primary purpose of life. The modern father, too, only knows to encourage this philosophy in his own son. Then later, when the son becomes a young man and faced with the reality of no traditional roles of manhood, no rites of passage which would have otherwise given him a sense of contentment and purpose, the young man is only brought up with the mindset that the meaning of life itself is solely to pursue what makes him happy. So it would seem inevitable that he would remain in a childlike state. Perpetually amusing oneself is a child's habit. Some grow out of, some don't. One thing of interest from a neurobiological standpoint, in light of the loss of rituals and a firm direction from enlightened father figures, young men today, when faced with being idle, needing to pass the time, they will naturally busy themselves with an almost infinite selection of and access to entertainment, pornography, travel, ever in pursuit of being an influencer. Taking into account a higher male propensity for the behavior reward cycle, i.e., the dopamine hit, it's no wonder that we have, as you have mentioned in your book, a generation of unmotivated, apathetic, underachieving young men. Because ultimately, growth is difficult. Growth requires discipline and feeling discomfort constantly. And I imagine from a psychological standpoint, the essential need and want of a man in any relationship is to be respected. When the modern man child realizes he is not getting it, and understandably so, in light of his immature state, it seems that this is a key factor then in why many men today move to one of the two extremes of either subservience to women with the backdrop of third, fourth wave feminism that is so antagonistic to men, such anti masculinity. Thus, they emasculate themselves. Or on the other extreme, as Brother Shahab had mentioned, they go to the extreme of misogynistic movements, i.e., the red pill movement, thus continuing to strain the modern male female dynamic. And having further contributed that, I leave it to you, Imam Dawud, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وأسواتنا محمد المصطفى وعلى آله الأصفياء وأصحابه الأتقياء والتابعين لهم بخير وإحسان إلى يوم الجزاء وعلينا معهم وفيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. First of all, I'd like to thank you all, Dr. Shahab, and then also yourself, Sidi, for your introductions of the topic and myself. And what I'm just going to do very briefly before we have our discussion with any, additional comments and elucidation on your behalf or any questions that maybe I can answer. I'll go into a little bit more depth about what inspired me to write the book, which,
Sorry, just one thing. We definitely want to introduce our main speaker here tonight. I think we had missed that in the opening. Dawood Walid is the executive director at the Michigan chapter of Council on American Islamic Relations, member of the Michigan Muslim Community Council, Imams Committee, and a senior fellow at Auburn Seminary based in New York. He has studied under scholars in the disciplines of Arabic grammar and morphology, foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, and sciences of the exegesis of the Quran. He previously served as an imam at Masjid Wali Muhammad in Detroit and the Bosnian American Islamic Center in Hamtramck, Michigan. He is the author of the books Blackness and Islam Towards Sacred Activism, as well as co-author of the book Centering Black Narrative, Black Muslim Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims, and Centering Black Narrative, Ahlul Bayt, Blackness and Africa. He's also the author of essays in the 2012 book, All American 45 American Men of Being Muslim, as well as the 2014 book, Quran in Conversation. He has lectured at over 100 institutions of higher learning in North America, Great Britain, and West Africa about Islam and social justice. He has been interviewed and quoted in over 150 outlets ranging from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, CNN, BBC, as well as Al Jazeera. In Walid was a 2011-2012 Fellow of the University of Southern California and the American Muslim Civil Leadership Institute, and a 2014-2015 Fellow of the Wayne State Law School Detroit Action Equity Lab. He has also received awards of recognition from the City Council of Detroit and Hamtramck, and from the Mayor of Lansing, as well as a number of other religious and community organizations. Sorry. Without further ado, Imam Dawud Walid, Jazakallah.
Oh, yeah. So I'll just get back to what I was saying about what inspired me to write the book. And some of it's been laid out already, so I don't want to go into too much regarding redundancy. But number one, and I'll mention three factors. Number one, some observations that some of my seniors, my teachers, as well as myself, have seen. And this phenomenon is actually spreading even beyond the West, but is spreading in other parts of the world as well, where we see the issue of a lot of young males who are unmotivated, not seeking to take on responsibility, even to the point of delaying marriage and not having any interests. This is one factor or one thing that sparked me to write this book. The second one was of the single mothers who were honest enough coming to me, and as well as some of our imams in our area, saying that we're looking for, or that they were looking for, masculine mentorship for their sons, with the recognition that yes, it does take that women and mothers need to play a part, and there needs to be a village concept as far as helping to raise up males to be healthy men. But the reality of it is that there needs to be men or mentorship or father figure types in the life of young men, because ultimately a woman cannot be a man, right? And a woman does not know how to walk this earth as a man in a man's shoes, right? It's just not possible, right? In its fullness, even though women can display certain traits of rujula, but the kamal, or the completeness of that, only can be fulfilled by men. And all women cannot be fathers, nor can they be future husbands for someone's daughters, right? The third point is the issue of a lot of sisters coming to us looking for husbands, right? And of some younger sisters, the issue of they feel as if they've taken the deen more seriously, they've gotten their education, and there's a scramble in many of their perceptions that there's not enough brothers out here for them to marry. For sisters that have been widowed or divorced too, they're a little bit older, not in their 20s or early 30s, but maybe going to their 40s, late 30s, early 40s, complaining and having a similar situation, like where are the brothers at, right? Where are the real men at? And we can maybe delve into that a little more, even as we talk about the need for sacred manhood. There also needs to be a resurrection of sacred womanhood, I believe. And as I think that there needs to be some tweaking and some recalibrating of some of the priorities of our males, I think that there needs to be some reprioritization, some rethinking some things from the sister side. But my primary task in this book, and also with my teaching, primarily in Metro Detroit, but even when I travel to other places, to really focus on the young men. My general instruction on like general religious matters or giving khutbah, of course, is to mixed gender. But in these durus or these private sessions, more of my concern and focus is on the tahdhib, the refinement or rectification of the young males. I'm done with my introductory comments. If the moderator can be brought back on.
Wow. Okay. MashaAllah. So we have some questions coming in, but just going through the book and having some context of how it developed. Was there anything? How has the reception been from the community at this point? And you brought up a good point. I think you had mentioned in one of your talks about just the way sacred manhood is being taught through guilds and other efforts. I think you'd mentioned about teaching sacred womanhood as well, and having a female ustada or alima coming and talking about those specific things. Is there anybody you have in mind, or is there anything you've seen that is trying to implement those things?
Okay, very good question. So when we're talking about this issue, firstly, the reception of the book, overwhelmingly, it's been good. We first kicked off the book launch in High Wycombe, which is in the UK. It's outside of London, I guess about an hour or so. We had the first book launch there. It's been discussed in several cities. My next stop of talking about the book, inshallah, will be later on in Rabiul Awal at Medina Institute with our teacher, Sheikh Mohammed bin Yahya Ninawi, Hafizullah Ta'ala. So we're going down there to do a workshop there. We've done it in some other cities and other places. So overall, the reception's been good. Well, I haven't really heard much criticism, but actually, ironically, one came across my text message this morning of someone in Canada who had a criticism of the book. So there were two basic criticisms. One, they were expecting more of a sociological perspective, and they were looking for, I guess, some to talk about certain issues that they were expecting that weren't actually laid out in the book. Which I think they probably missed the introduction of the book. And I do talk about some of these issues in the introduction in some chapters about some maladies. But when we're talking about raising young males in the sacred manhood, that the important part is to talk about the virtues that need to be embodied and like the models of those embodied characteristics, right? And also an introduction that clearly mentions that this book is talking about these different madarij or different chains of virtues and how they are scaled. But at the same time, this book is written from the traditional perspective that our deen is not transmitted just simply from matun or from written books. It's from as-sudur. It's from the living, breathing hearts of people who have a chain of transmission and who have learned, who pass on this information through not only teaching a text, but through embodiment. And that's the whole part of us trying to resurrect our tradition, right? So it isn't this sort of, without mentioning this type of orientation, the book isn't meant to just, oh, you pick up the book for yourself and ta-da, then you just seek to implement everything on your own without a guide or without some sort of teaching process involved, right? Similar to how I wrote the book Towards Sacred Activism was the same thing. Like that was just a primer towards the issue of faith-based activism from the Quran and Sunnah perspective. The second thing is the locations. Well, let me mention the second critique before I go to what we've been doing here in Detroit and what's been going on in a few of the locations. The other critique was that in some of the references in the book that I used too many so-called Sufi, that's how they pronounce it, like Soofee, Sufi references, right? Well, the reality of it is that the authors of this topic of Islamic chivalry or el fatua, they were all connected to a tariqa, primarily the Qadri tradition, right? This is just the reality. And even many of them were Hanbali, and there in traditional Islam, there was never this so-called misinformation that Sufism is some sort of like separate mystical branch of Islam. No, it's part of one of the three sciences, Mission Hadith Jibril alayhi salam, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, according to the riwayah of Abu Huraira and Sahih al-Bukhari, rahimullah ta'ala, mentions the question, what is Iman first, then what is Islam, then what is Ihsan? And Iman in this hadith means our aqidah, those basic things of our creed that we must know and understand intellectually. Islam represents our basic fiqh around our 5 pillars. This is the law. And then Ihsan, this is what we would call spiritual purification, the sciences of the heart to get to this stage of worshiping Allah as if we can see Allah, knowing we cannot see Allah, but if we can't see Allah, then know Allah sees you. This is called tasawwuf, right? So the likes of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, the Hanbali, which I quote often in this, I mean, he was what we would call a Sufi. Ibn al-Mi'mar al-Hanbali, who I quote in the book quite a bit, or his book, he was Sufi. Sheikh at-Tustari, who was Hanbali, was Sufi, etc., 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 right? So I just had to put that out there. Like, yeah, this is the tradition of akhlaq, of instilling noble traits of character, that this book is based upon that genre. I didn't make it up. This is part of our tradition, and I reference these books. Now the other part is what we've done, and in some areas, we've established some of the pillars, not all 5, but there's basically 5 aspects of what we would call a fatwa guild, right? And it raises people up by degrees or stages. Similarly, how the Boy Scouts, they used to be the Boy Scouts, now there's the Scouts, because now transgenders can join and girls and everything. It's not even the Boy Scouts anymore. But where you have the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts, and the Eagle Scouts, right? Like you have 3 different grades. Well, you have number 1, the teaching of adab that comes first in that tarbiyah. This is the first part. And this can be done for the younger males, right? Those who get to be older. So for instance, you can't go to young people who are 7 years old, let's say 6, 7 years old. You can't teach them complicated things about Aqidah, right? Because they don't have the cognitive ability, nor the discipline to sit in the class. And especially for young boys, and this is a mistake about how a lot of young boys get diagnosed as ADHD, right? They don't sit still at a young age and to be expected to be sitting in these seats, especially how young girls tend to maybe be more calm, or they mature emotionally quicker than young males. Young guys want to run around and jump off of tables and do all sorts of things, right? That's what the young males do, right? And to expect them to really sit still for 7 hours or 6 hours is really insane, actually. And I'm not saying this as a psychological diagnosis. I have no background in Western psychology. The second point is then the teaching of ilm, right? And the first of this ilm is to teach people the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the first obligation of this deen is to know Allah. Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, I did not create jinn nor men except to worship me alone. Ibn Abbas says that this means liya'rifun, means to know Allah. Then of this stage, so we've done this in our area with the halaqa of then we also teach adab, and then also basic Islamic teachings from theology. Okay. The other part is organized community service, or el khidmatul lijaliya, the organized community service. And by the way, these 5 points I'm making, they were established in the time of the Abbasiyin during their government. And we know the first 5 khulafa are called the rightly guided khulafa. Then you have khulafa Bani Umayyah after them, starting with Muawiyah, who's a Sahabi. Then the criminal Yazid was the second of those Salatin. Then you have Bani Abbas. So this is like Bani Abbas starts ruling in the time of like Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik. So during the time of the Abbasiyin, these 5 principles were established under this sultan named Nasir al-Din Allah. The third aspect, again, is the organized community service, right? And we've organized community service for youth, such as shoveling snow during the wintertime. We have a list, people who are the elderly or single mothers. We have a list when it snows, and we take the youth, or some of them are close by, go shovel snow, for instance. We have organized things. We also, in the tarbiyah, we take them for fishing trips, hunting trips, going to camp out to get outside of the comfort of their homes, right? And from away from the warmth and coddling of their mothers sometimes, because sometimes the mothers coddle their sons too much and produce mama's boys. The fourth of these that we talk about, and this also relates to the hunting, but is what is called the sacred physical activities, right? So Ustad Nisar, Ustad Nisar Sheikh, Hafidullah Ta'ala, he did a translation of Prophetic Grappling. It's a book of As-Suyuti that talks about the hadith of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the Sahaba regarding the wrestling and the grappling that they did, right? So part of this is training the young men in the martial arts. This helps with discipline, besides physical activity, and to teach them a little bit of courage and how to take a whipping and get back up, right? So we have the jujitsu classes here in the Zawiya. Sifu Jabir is one of our elders that leads it, and another brother. This is all, we do this at Dar Rahma, at the Zawiya in west side of Detroit. We have archery every Saturday. Teaching boys archery is sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ did this and instructed the Sahaba to teach their sons archery, right? So these are some of the things that we do as far as the physical activities. And of course, they take them out to hunting during hunting season, deer season, with the bow and the arrow, the archery. This is right before gun season. Then the fifth of this that we have not established is the skilled trades or the artisan guilds, because at that time, they taught the young males how to read, how to write, mathematics, right? Or some people call it 3 R's. They also taught them the skill to do something with their hands. And this is very important, that men need to learn how to be handy and to do something with their hands. At that time, there was a useful utility, because they needed someone to learn how to make the swords, because they were fighting the Crusaders at the time. They need someone knew how to make the horseshoes. They'd be trained on making horseshoes, swords, horseshoes. Even someone who knew how to make rings, the silver aqiq ring that the brothers wear, the men wear, right? And an aqiq ring is sunnah, right? Brothers, you should try to wear an aqiq. If you don't wear aqiq, this is sunnah. So that they would do a service for the ummah, but that they would learn a skill, that they'd be able to have a job to support a wife. So these are the 5 aspects, right? The teaching and the raising up of the adab, the teaching of the fardun ayn and the basic knowledge that one must know to be a proper Muslim, and with the halaqah that reinforces the adab. You have the community service that helps with the humility and to be selfless, not selfish. You have the aspect of the sacred martial arts and physical activities and the archery, self-defense, discipline, precision, accuracy, and then the artisan guilds. These are the 5 things. We've established 4 of those. There's other communities in Pittsburgh have done something similar, in Oakland. There's different areas that are doing these things. Sorry for the long answer.
Oh,
but
no, that was great.
It's a long answer.
No, that was excellent. I think they gave us action items for our communities. We'll go back and forth between me and A1, inshallah. Because we're getting a lot of questions coming through Facebook and YouTube. The question is, how do we as Muslims view the various red pill figures who speak 20% truth? I don't know if it's 0%, 20%, Allahu Alam. But how do we view those movements? First question. Second question, I know we talked a little bit about the term alpha and how we viewed that and how you kind of thought there's certain connotation that may not be negative in certain aspects. So how do we view the various red pill movements and some of those online movements? I don't know how much you've had to deal with people who, cite Andrew Tate as their sheikh or what not, but kind of what your thoughts were about that.
So I first heard about Andrew Tate in the UK. I'd never heard of him before. I watched a little bit of one of his videos. I'm like, this guy sounds like a fool. There's other people in the so-called manosphere that I've watched some of their videos. I watched some of the videos of the late Kevin Samuels that wasn't as profane and a little more sharper in his presentation. So look, before talking about what are the problems of red pill, I think we need to also mention why these young men get attracted to red pill, right? And that's because extremes breed other extremes, right? So when we've had a discourse that's going on in our country that's not only been considered to be radical feminism, but has waded into misandry, when we have movements that seek to even erase gender at all and say that it doesn't even mean anything to be a man, right? And when these young guys don't see religious authority speaking to these things directly or firmly, then there's a vacuum, and that vacuum is red pill. And the reality of it is, and we even have a couple of people who are Muslims, who are a few people who are on YouTube who are, we could say, are Muslim red pill. These people are filling a vacuum, and I think that a number of their comments and framework is misguided, but it just goes to show that when the du'at and the mashayikh aren't taking the lead, and at the locations where people are at to get information, then there's other people who step in, and this is just a reality. And especially with social media, because now anyone can get a microphone with no qualifications. Anyone can speak. They have no qualifications. What even makes Andrew Tate an expert about anything, right? I mean, for instance, right? The other thing is that a lot of these young males have not taken the discipline to study to filter out what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. So we have the hadith, right? El hikmatu dalatul mu'min. So wisdom's lost property to the believer, right? But when that person you're listening to is on kufr, they're on disbelief. They don't believe in the Quran, which we believe is our incontrovertible objective truth. They don't believe in Nabiullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, which who we believe is the perfect human being, who was a man. He's a perfect human being, he's a perfect man. In his kamal, he was a man, right? When people don't believe in that, then obviously something in their discourse is going to be wanting, is going to be deficient. Out just substantively, not even talking about their lack of adab, right? So this is part of the problem with red pill and people sometimes who listen to it. Is not as if everything they say is wrong, but there's also an old saying that, well, even a broken clock gets the time right twice in the day, right? So not that everything they say is wrong, but if even it's 15% of it that's grossly wrong, that becomes a problem when our young people, our young males, try to uh, um, act upon that, right? They try, and it becomes weaponized in the community against our women, or it gets weaponized against other men who don't co-sign that nonsense, and they get called simps. We called, oh yeah, he's like Brokeback Mountain. He's a simp. He's soft, whatever, right? Or There's other names that have been thrown out that I won't get into, that even some Muslims online have even referred to some imams. So we won't get into that, or those individuals' names. So this is a problem in regards to rape. Now the alpha male issue. I don't use that labeling because it's not my discourse. I believe in us using our own language and not being trapped inside of other people's meta narratives or inside the confines of their nomenclature. I just don't do it. So I don't even use this term alpha male. Just like I don't use the term toxic masculinity. Like masculinity is in the wasat, it's in the middle. Anything too far to the right or too far left is not masculinity or sacred manhood. So to me, there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. Like to me, there's no such thing as an Islamic terrorist. There is no such thing as Islamic terrorist because those two words totally contradict each other. And then we don't say toxic femininity, right? And there's a scheme behind that, within the language. No one talks about toxic femininity. I don't believe we should use the term toxic femininity either, right? But there's a level of misandry in that term. But the traits of what someone calls an alpha male, who will stand up, who has a level of vitality and vigor, who's going to take initiative to take the bull by its horns, that's going to have the robustness to stand up for what he believes and to confront adversaries and to protect his family and his interests, that's not negative. And that's part of what people call an alpha male, right? Those aren't negative traits, right? If someone is emotionless and who is a brute, then that should not be connected with real masculinity. That's not an alpha male, and that's not toxic masculinity. That's an extreme. But we should not call that masculinity. It has nothing to do with manhood. If someone is a brute or acting like a Fir'aun around weaker men, or around women folk, around children, being abusive or cussing women out, think that they gotta like proverbially put women in their places like their property. That's unmanly. And we should start using that language. That's not toxic masculinity. That's unmanly. It's unmanly.
Absolutely. There's just one comment before I get to Amir's question. Like, I feel like this conversation always gets, people are afraid to go to the pulpit with it or even talk about it, because if you're talking about this, you're almost in objection to femininity or women's issues, which this is not the case. And a lot of people have taken the easy road out, right? Because it just becomes a conversation of two people dueling against each other, two different narratives. But what I find really great about this book is that it's not in contradiction to any other movement. It's about people taking responsibility for themselves. When, even in our tradition, before you look at someone else, you have to look at what you can do better. What can the Muslim men do better? What can we do to our own character that will give us value, rather than being crybabies and saying, hey, yo, man, the world's against me. Like, we have to look in the mirror, because my experience, knowing a lot of people who are hanging out in their basements on their sweatpants, getting Uber Eats, and just on Call of Duty on their headset. How is that productive human being, right? And looking through these characteristics, generosity, altruism, empathy for those around you. These are not going to be inculcated by running from yourself in the mirror. So, no, alhamdulillah, that was a great explanation. Amir, I know you had a few questions coming through your feed
Sheikh,
too.
when we have these discussions about fatwa, it seems like there's two audiences we think of, like, for example, like brothers in our WhatsApp groups. There's the man child who perhaps know nothing about fatwa. But then, more so to my question, there are students of knowledge, good brothers who love the deen, and fatwa is a recurring theme when it comes to their marital dynamics. Like, what is the prophetic balance? For example, like And I think these are beautiful definitions. Some of the definitions in the book, that fatwa is to be just, but never to seek justice. And that if we are given, we prefer others, and if we are denied, we are still grateful. And truly, time after time, I know, I know of brothers, and they want to reach this high maqam, but they're human. And so, let's say if their family members or their spouses, they may behave ungrateful to them, rude, undermine them, and undermine their input. Um, how does one navigate not becoming meek and just subservient? Like what? Because that does seem to be the general vibe I personally get in circles of sacred knowledge that take the high road. The prophetic way is to be patient, to forbear, and sometimes it becomes difficult, and then I imagine that's why some of these figures in these manospheres are attractive.
Okay. So we know that the most perfect human being and the most perfect man, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in Surah Al-Ahzab. لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا. He said, most certainly you were given the most beautiful example in the messenger of God for whoever's hope is in Allah and the final day, whoever makes dhikr Allah. Right. So he is the model. So the more that we orientate ourselves to him spiritually, and the more we intellectually learn about him from proper teachers, then the greater effect this will have in changing our inward states, which then should translate over to our behavior. And again, he is the model of moderation, right? He's a model of moderation. So how we look at moderation is through his example. Okay, so we know that the Prophet ﷺ was very compassionate and very merciful, right? We know that he kissed his grandchildren. Famous hadith about this, right? That he went and kissed his grandson Hassan, and one of the new Muslims said, "Oh, I have 10 sons. I've never kissed them." He said, "Men la yarham la yarham." Whoever doesn't show mercy won't receive mercy, right? When his daughter Fatima Zahra radiallahu anha came in the house, he would get up from his seat, he would kiss her, he would hold her hand and sit her down where he was sitting, and he would, or to the right or to the left, and he would sit down next to her. He's very gentle. He used to be very kind to his wife. Our mother Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, said, never did the Prophet ﷺ ever hit any of his wives or any servant with his hand. He only struck with his hand. Fi sabilillah. We know this, right? At the same time, if his wife was out in public and uh, and acted rudely, Ya Aisha, Inna Allah la yuhibbu fasha mutafahush. O Aisha, surely Allah does not love lewd speech nor lewd behavior. Mahlan ya Aisha. Calm down, Aisha. Chill out. Mahlan ya Aisha. Inna Allah rafiqun yuhibbu riq fi amri kullihi. O Aisha, you gotta chill out. Surely Allah is tender and he loves kindness in all matters. So he would correct his wives too, and he would show leadership. He was the imam of his household. He was the imam of his wives. And he was very gently, when he was wrong, he would pull them back in. He was like, look, this isn't the right way. Right? He did the same thing with his children, other people in the family, right? So he would help in the house and sweep up, but he also picked up the sword. He went out to battle. He was at Badr and at Uhud, right? He picked up the sword too. So he was a well-rounded man. Now, how do we come closer to this? This is very important. Number one, we ourselves into our youth, we first get them to fall in love with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It starts off with reading to them and learning about his sifat, the Shamal al-Muhammadiyya by Imam al-Tirmidhi. We start off with this, right? And we've now come into Rabi al-Awwal. We should be giving more of our time to reading about the Shamal and reading Sirah during this month. This is the month of Sirah. Ramadan is the month of Quran. This is the month of Sirah, right? Number two, we increase in sending our salawat upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to attach our hearts and soften our hearts to connect with him. As some of our teachers say, we should do this a minimum of 1,000 times a day and increase it on Yom al-Jum'ah. We increase it on the night and day of Jum'ah. I try to do it at least 1,000 times every day, and Jum'ah day, 2,000. You sit with your tasbih and count and put some time and count, right? Then we sit with the teachers who embody this behavior as best as we can, or those elders, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Al-ulama warathatul anbiya." The scholars are the inheritors of the prophets, and these are the ones who have sanad, who sat with teachers, who sat with teachers, who sat with teachers, who sat with teachers, and an unbroken chain going back to the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through Hassan and Hussein to Sayyidina Ali, or back to Abu Bakr Siddiq, to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? This is our tradition, right? And this is how we come closer to that behavior and displaying this properly in our households. Now, of course, none of us are ma'soom. This is a lifelong struggle, right? I'm not claiming to be anywhere at the level of the maqam of the awliya, right? Like, and I'm mudhnib, right? I'm striving to be better, right? But at least I have some sense of who to connect to and the roadmap, right? And that's a big part that's missing. Like, how can you get how can you drive to the destination of manhood if you don't have the roadmap of how to get there? Then you could just driving around lost. If you don't have like a spiritual GPS, how are you going to get there? Right? You're not going to get there on your own.
Yeah, no, that's a big point about finding your guide and sticking to how you're going to correct yourself.
And yes,
and-
I apologize. Yes, what your answer, for the audience as well. A lot of what you said speaks to the chapter of loving and loathing for the sake of Allah. And one thing I found interesting is that the Sunnah is all over the book, but in this chapter particularly, it struck me that when it comes to loathing, the characteristics of loathing or refusing for the sake of Allah, in this chapter particularly, you mentioned attending the gatherings, remembering and striving to emulate the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then I thought to myself, you also mentioned salawat, and in this chapter you mentioned the root of love for Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam is this self-annihilation. And I thought to myself, the more salawat, the more one strives to emulate to be like him, then you become more measured in your heated responses, or when you have to rebuke somebody, then you don't overdo it necessarily, because you try to emulate, and in a sense harmonize with the sunnah as best as possible. And I imagine that's not only a personal effort, but it's also khair from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ultimately, we can't do it alone. Yeah. And Shahab, you were saying? Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going through some of this feed here about some of the questions. It looks like we have a lot, so I'm going to try to get through as many as I can. Do you find any challenges particular to our community that might be different, considering the context with which we live or influences going on?
Yes, there's a number of challenges. Number one, most of us don't live in real communities, right? We have a masjid in which we commute to. We don't live close by to each other. the issue of extended families have broken down, which this used to be a major aspect in child rearing of sacred masculinity and sacred femininity. So the extended family was replaced by the so-called nuclear family. Now the nuclear family itself is disintegrating, right? So this is a reality that we have in our communities. We don't live around other Muslims. Most of us don't, in which we're walking distance of a masjid where we have righteous people who are neighbors that we actually know our neighbors. Ask yourself, how many of your neighbors do you know to the left of, or to your left or to your right or behind you or before you? Just ask yourself that question to yourselves, right? How many of us really know these people, or if we do know them, will we trust them? Right, with our young people, as far as ethically, passing down ethics and morality. Um, so these are challenges that we have of the breakdown of the extended family and the breakdown of the community, in which some places in the world, especially if you go to West Africa, you still see this. You still see the village concept of what they say is like it takes a village to raise a boy to be a man. You still see the village concept in a lot of these places, right? So this is one major thing. The other thing in the word that was mentioned earlier was postmodernism. I mean, sending our children to public schools. There's a level of spiritual danger sending our children to public schools. They get introduced to sexual and gender confusion in elementary school these days. Our young boys can go through school in those formative years and maybe never have a man as a teacher. They grow up and for 7 hours a day, 6, 7 hours a day, they're around nothing but female teachers. That's a problem. And as sincere as those teachers are, that's a problem because there's nothing masculine or masculine energy that's being transmitted. Okay, because learning is about more than just didactical of giving information. Learning is much more than that, right? It's much more than picking up a book and having someone put some stuff up on a screen, right? This is another problem. Another problem is even the education. I meant the education, the entertainment that our young people are exposed to, right? Uh, uh, I never let my children when they were younger watch Disney, and it's worse now. Disney promotes disrespect of authority, in particular parental authority, right? Besides now gender confusion and emasculation of males or men, Disney, Disney movies or cartoons, this is straight from the shaitan. And then these little shayateen that many of us give our our boys at too young of an age, when they open up the door to like, would you let a stranger come into your son's bedroom off the street that's like 12 years old? You would let some random guy, Joe Schmo, uh, uh, come off the street and be alone with your sons in their bedrooms, but yet you give them these shayateen right here, right, at a young ages. And this is what part of the problem that of pornography amongst our young males, even young guys starting at elementary school looking at porn on their phones. But this is why pornography and masturbation is such a big problem that's literally doing spiritual damage and hurting the souls of our youth. And by the way, there's even many Muslims who are adults who don't know that masturbation is haram. Per Suratul Mu'minun, like there's an ayah about it, right? Like it talks about what is lawful for sexual intercourse, and then it says, and those who've gone past that, they have exceeded the limits, right? So our scholars unanimously say masturbation is forbidden. Um, so like these are problems and these are issues, where we have the breakdown of the extended family, the breakdown of community. Um, we have the issue of what's being taught in public schools that is that in many ways I believe is satanic. I'll say it like that. Uh, the satanic entertainment that's used to target children, and then the shayateen, which opened up the door to all sorts of pornography and encourages and gets these young guys to start masturbating. And then too, if they do meet a woman and get older, and I know of cases like this because I'm an imam, I have a lot of people come to me. They've seen so much porno and masturbated so much that if their young wife isn't acting or performing in the bed like a porno star, he can't even get erect. He can't even get stimulated. So then what? Then he goes out and gets prostitutes. Or in my area, they get trans Muslim guys in Dearborn, Michigan, getting transgender prostitutes off of Michigan Avenue. Right? They watch so much porno, they can't even get excited by their wives anymore. They have to take it to the next level of their shahwa. Right? So this is spiritually dangerous.
I mean, that is a big topic, and I'm glad you highlighted that, because it's kind of shoved beneath the carpet. Nobody wants to talk about it, but I have family friends who are psychiatrists. You'd be surprised the people who are spiritually inclined, known in the community, they're struggling with this. They're addicted to these things, and these are societal things. I was watching a show, I think it was Jon Stewart, which dates me, but I was watching that show, and he made a joke about that. I was like, damn, that's a pretty perverted joke, but the entire audience laughed. That is an acceptable form of being, right? And for Muslims who find who it's forbidden, that is a big part. And one of these authors, David Sedaris, wrote that if you want to kill a society, just make sure their men are addicted to those things, because it'll zap their energy.
Yeah.
Zap their energy. And so you're talking about amotivational syndrome, that could be a big cause.
Actually, who also spoke about this recently, I'm not a big fan of his, but I know how to take the good and leave bad behind. But Bill Maher talked about this about maybe 2 weekends ago, and he had this thing, and they were talking about this issue of pornography and how it's literally sapped the masculinity out of a lot of men in their drive, because of the and Bill Maher, by the way, is an atheist. Right, he's an atheist saying that.
Right. Yes. And neurobiologically, there's a phenomenon called hedonic adaptation, which relating to the deen. We're born with this fitra, and even this natural fitra for what we find pleasurable. And all forms of entertainment, especially pornography, have become so addictive that the threshold for what is stimulating is raised to such a level that from you can't even be stimulated by your spouse to just sitting in somewhat silence with your elders. That's not stimulating enough. The hedonic adaptation, the threshold for what is intellectually, physically stimulating, the fitra has been distorted, and uh, many times, subhanallah, it takes years if one is fortunate enough by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to get on the right track. It can take years for many of these brothers to get right again. And what, that's one of the interesting things about fasting, where the halal becomes haram during those times. It's almost as if to reset your threshold, reset your baseline, and not become too, do not indulge too much in what's halal but pleasurable. Yes.
What also helps reset that is quiet moments and training our young men to be in gatherings of salawat and dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? To give them times when they can get to reset or rebalance, where they're not on their phones. And we do this. We have the gatherings, no phones in the Zawiya area, no one's out on their phones, and we do the dhikr. And this is a way of helping to reset that, exactly what you're talking about, because
Mm.
these things are overly stimulating. And even myself, I found myself being on checking my phone too much, and it was slowing me down from doing some things. I got rid of all like social media accounts like 2 years ago, and subhanallah, I finished writing one book, and like halfway finished writing my other book, and wrote a foreword,
Mm.
introduction to Sheikh Mohammed Mendez's book, right? Just like the time that I would waste just looking at stuff on fake book, because most of that stuff is fake anyway, like fake book, and these things, right? Just scrolling and looking at things, but it does something to our psyches, being on these phones all the time, right? And especially on these social media sites that are designed to give you things in your algorithm to keep you entrapped, and you just want to go more and more and more and more, and it can become like a drug, right? So then, no wonder like a lot of our young men get drawn into like these bad images in porno, because once they go on, the algorithm or the sites just keep feeding them and feeding them and feeding them, right? It's like crack.
Absolutely. And I think someone said it like, Instagram, for instance, like they get your demographics and it's 1-2 steps before they throw something at you that'll get you right off the track. So, we have to keep all of these things in consideration. Like Facebook, for instance, came up with the red notification after all these studies, because red is what we associate with fire. So your notifications turn red. And they were looking at some of these, the male brain, how it's overly sensitive to dopamine reward, right? So social media apps, WhatsApp, I think WhatsApp is in social media. Honestly, it's got so much going on now. It can become that portal that changes your entire life and how you interact with all these devices. We have about 6 minutes left, so if we could try to go through like a rapid fire on just some questions, if possible. If they're too long to explain, then we can move on to the next one. So we have a question from Mir Ali. Living up to the modern standard of man is really unrealistic and unmanly, in my humble opinion. Can the panel discuss how to be a man in this current society without being termed as a misogynist?
Frankly, not care about being labeled a misogynist. That once you learn what you need to do, and if it's in accordance with the prophetic sunnah, and you are taking counsel from other people of the tradition, that no matter how people blame you, or no matter what they say, that you know that you are sticking and trying to follow the path as best as you can, right? So it's really the courage to not to be worried of the fear mongers and those who would seek to blame you, right? And many times we cancel ourselves. We cancel ourselves by our own anxieties of not wanting to be called something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One more. Yeah, Shaykh, please address current challenge of sexualization of society versus Islamic spirituality / piety.
So this society has been overly sexualized, and the barriers have been put down. Just very briefly, there's a narration attributed to Sayyidina Ali, Kramallahu ta'ala wajhu radiyallahu an, that says that angels were created with aql, or intellect, without shahwa, without carnal desires. And beasts were created with carnal desires without aql. He said, but the insan was created with both, with aql and shahwa. The one that uses their aql to control their shahwa is at a rank higher than the angels. But the one who lets their shahwa, their carnal desires, overpower them, then he sinks lower than a beast. He's lower than a beast, right? So when we talk about this, part of our striving and our suluk, right, is to contain and control these shahwa. How do we do this? Number one, first, uh, being physically strong is good, and I work out, and I used to play, high school and college football and all that type of stuff. But the strong man is not the one who can bench press 300 pounds. The strong man is the one who can get up at that last third of the night and bench press those bed sheets off and make tahajjud, right? And implore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help, to help you strengthen that part of our hearts. That aql is connected to our qalb, our spiritual heart, that helps us in controlling these animalistic desires to chase after money, to chase after things that feed our egos, to find cars, or to like want to be a pimp. Really, PIMP is really an acronym. It's playing an imaginary man part. PIMP, playing imaginary man part, because a pimp ain't really a man, right? To fast minimum 3 days, a month outside the month of Ramadan, right? Minimum 3 days, to help us in controlling our desires, and to being in suhbah, in healthy suhbah, or in good company, as the narration through the chain of Abu Dharr radhiyallahu anhu, that says being alone is better than being in bad company, but being in righteous company is better than being alone, right? So the ahwal, our our ahwal, or spiritual states, gets the positive or negative energy from the ahwal of other people that we are around. And if we're around other people that are involved in this type of suluk and type of dhikr and fasting, who are striving to be upright men, then that's going to help us in our spiritual states. But if we're logging in, to red pill, if we're listening to Andrew Tate drop F-bombs, and talking about taking advantage of women, but then we think we're cool just because we say our 5 daily prayers, that's sadly mistaken.
Mm. One point I really liked about how you, in the book, you talked about, restraining sexual desires. Like, this is something that is I don't know if it's a manly trait, but it's a trait that we should aspire for. I don't think the Quran and the Sunnah ever doesn't acknowledge our true fitra. These are tough challenges, right? But rising above them and having that perspective, I really like that in the book. It helps, I would say, a younger mind probably categorize what they're feeling without feeling like they're out of place. So those are all good points. One more question we had. What kind of teaching and curriculum can we focus on with our young boys and young men? I feel like you kind of spoke about that earlier, but if there's one trait that you would feel like is the most important that is missing from today's kind of curriculum of children's education, especially young boys, what would that be?
Maybe not as much as curriculum, but to be in an area, or to travel to an area where there's actually qualified teachers teaching the children. See, we have to increase and do better. See, many Islamic schools, or many masajid that had weekend programs, the masjid established, okay, some uncle who's a doctor, engineer, or some auntie would be teaching the Islamic studies class. They don't have ijaz in a single text. They don't have a senate connecting them back to any scholars, right? And they did the best that they could, but number one, many of them miseducated young people about Islam, or taught them certain things outside of their proper order or proper sequence, which is also another form of miseducation, and also lacked the spiritual connection in the Sened going back to the inheritors of the prophets. So it is not necessarily about the curriculum. The curriculum is set by the qualified teacher. It is firstly having a qualified teacher before trying to, and I always tell people this too, right? Like, it's dangerous to think you can pick up a book and teach it on your own without having gone through given ijaza or being trained and teaching yourself. Like I tell people, especially new Muslims, the worst thing you could do is to pick up Sahih al-Bukhari and try to read it on your own. You thoroughly confuse yourself. It may even shake your iman, right? You need a teacher to read that book. You need a teacher for Riyadh al-Salihin, right? You need a teacher for that. Or Sunnah Tirmidhi. Even for this issue of fatwa, right? Like Kitab Sulami or something like that. Like you should get someone to go through it or do a makra'ah that has at least some sort of understanding about the terminology and the nomenclature, right? At the least, right? So it's less about the curriculum and more about the teachers.
Okay. Amir, I will give you one more question and then inshallah some closing words from Imam Dawud.
Yes, alhamdulillah. It seems that you know, one of the things I got from this book is I think the name of the game is that it'll be a lifelong struggle. We're in a perpetual state of trying to find balance, and it's never like we arrive. And it's uh, as I grew older, I always when I was younger, I always had the perception that you reach this state or whatever struggles you're going through, they're not supposed, they're not natural. For example, when you're a young man, sexual desire and so forth. But just as we get older, that validation that to attain a high character, uh, it's from the nafs that you're constantly struggling, and that there'll never be a day where you arrive necessarily. And then mashallah, like perhaps the awliya, Allahu alam, what internally was going on for them. But for, in a modern time, I do feel like it's a perpetual struggle, and I've resigned to the fact that perhaps into my old age, I will be constantly struggling against my nafs, and trying to attain all of these qualities that you laid out as I was going through the book. These qualities, truthfulness, loving and loathing, vigilant care. Um, it's it's a it's just something that one has to go through everything and realize that if you're working on something, maybe some other quality is dissipating, and it's a lifelong pursuit.
One thing I'll say in conclusion, you talked about the ego,
Mm,
and we heard the same from our Spanish brothers. Su amigo, su ego es no su amigo. Like your ego is not your amigo. Your ego is not your friend.
mm,
And the issue of arrogance, right, that slows us down in our spiritual warfare. I have to say this to be clear. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wept before his Lord, right? There is nothing unmanly about crying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and confessing your weakness before him subhanahu wa ta'ala and your weakness in front of the people. There's nothing unmanly about it. That's very manly, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did it and cried and wept at certain occasions. Just as he saw Hamza martyred, he cried over him at the battlefield, right? After the battle was over, not in the heat of the battle, but when the battle was over, right? So we have to say that we have to reorientate this, because we've been told that certain emotions, as you mentioned, are unmanly or should be act like they're evil. Shahwa, or sexual desires, is not inherently evil. Now, acting on them in an impermissible way, that's bad. But the desire itself is not inherently evil. Likewise, crying is not inherently unmanly, right? Crying is manly under the right circumstance. And a man who never cried before his Lord, or cried over a mistake he made, or cried over a family member or friend that died, this is a person with a hard heart. This is not a man. This is a person that's gone somewhere else outside of manliness. So I
mm.
just had to say that to break this up,
Um,
because
wow.
Prophet ﷺ cried to his
Mm.
Lord. Right? Abu Bakr
Yeah.
Siddiq, they say, used to lead the prayer, that sometimes he couldn't get through the prayer because he would be hearing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and when he would recite and it was talking about Allah's punishment, he would start crying during the salah. He couldn't finish the salah because the words shook his soul so much. Will we ever dare to say Abu Bakr Siddiq was not a real man?
Subhanallah. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask one question just because I know someone really wanted to have this question answered.
Okay.
Is this a new genre of books? And what do you think is a historical timeline of like focusing on gender or males? Or is this just something that is more relevant right now? Or what's the historical context of that?
There have been books and chapters of books written on El Fatuwa, Sacred Chivalry, and Al-Rajula going back centuries. This is not a new genre. It's just something that I wrote about, and there's been English translations of other books. In particular, As-Sulami's work on Fatuwa has been translated in English before. I think it's called Sufic Chivalry by As-Sulami. But Kitab As-Sulami was written during the time of the Abbasiyin on a book of Islamic Manhood and Chivalry. Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani al-Hanbali wrote a book on the same title of Kitab al-Futuwa relating to Islamic chivalry and manhood. We have Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, in his book Madarij Salikin, wrote a chapter on al-Futuwa. We're talking about an issue in which our scholars wrote about centuries and centuries ago, very specifically, but they didn't make things up. What they are, it wasn't a new genre then per se. They just compiled it under a certain framework, but they took things from the Quran, from the Sunnah, and from the sayings and actions of the first three generations, and they categorized it. But I mean, what I wrote is not like any sort of novel discourse. There's many books. Imam al-Qushayri and Risala al-Qushayriya, he has a chapter on al-Fatuwa in that book, right? There's several books that talk about sacred manhood and Islamic chivalry, as well as chapters in books. Imam Ghazali talked about Fatuwa, again, Imam Ghazali.
SubhanAllah. So my closing thoughts, I do think this is a topic that we need to focus on as men, as fathers, as husbands. Fatwa and raising males into sacred manhood. I really enjoyed reading this. I do think it's at least sparked the conversation and the thought that instead of doing the Crimea River, the world's changed. There's a lot of work we need to do to be contributors to society at large, our families, and our communities. So I think this will definitely start the conversation. You gave us some great resources. Jazakumullah. Inshallah, we're going to close with a dua. And also there's a link to purchase the book from the website, which is also on our website. So please purchase a copy. Send us your feedback. And Imam Dawud Walid is available on his website. You can reach out to him via that. Inshallah, Imam Dawud, if you could close us with the dua, inshallah.
Yes, and again, if you go to Imam Ghazali Institute's website, the book is on there, and I encourage you to get the book. And if you follow me on, I rarely update my website. I'm really bad at that, having someone to do it for me. But on Telegram, if you find me on Telegram, then I normally post advertisements of where I'm going to speak about this subject. So I'm in New York this upcoming Friday for Park 51 Community for Khutbatul Jummah.
Nice.
The following weekend, I'm at Mass Youth Conference, inshallah, talking about this. Then in October 22nd, and October 21st and 22nd, I will be with Sheikh Ninoui down in Atlanta, inshallah, for a workshop on Fatuwa, the khutbah, and also for the Al-Mawlid Nabawi, the Mawlid celebration of the birth of our beloved Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So that's the tartib for October, and then you can find out also where we'll be at talking about Fatuwa, if it's in your locality or anywhere if you're traveling in November or in January. I'm taking December off, inshallah,
Awesome.
from traveling.
Inshallah. All right. All right. We can close with the dua, inshallah.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله.
Jazakumullah, everyone. Take care.